Hi, everybody. Thank you. Welcome. We are so excited to host our second speaker this semester for the Five College Digital Humanities Speaker Series. As you know, Five College Digital Humanities is responsible for bringing new technological perspectives to humanities work. We work across all five colleges, but we often host our talks here, but technically we're here for five colleges. Today's speaker, near and dear to my heart, I'm very excited. We came through the same sort of fellowship programs in terms of becoming professors, so it's always fun to welcome someone who you feel like is one of your own. Today, we're very excited to introduce you to Jessica Marie Johnson, who is currently an assistant professor of history at Michigan State University, but we'll be moving on now to Johns Hopkins University as assistant professor there in the history and Africana studies departments. As a digital humanist, Johnson engages ways digital and social media disseminate and create historical narratives, in particular, comparative histories of slavery and people of African descent, and the power of radical media to create social change. Johnson continues to make media projects as a member of multiple collaborative projects, all of which you can find on Twitter and also online in other places as well. She holds a PhD from the University of Maryland, College Park, and a BA in African American Studies, woot, from Washington University, which we also share. We have a lot in common. You're also from Chicago, right?
Yes. Yep.
It's amazeballs.
We're doing the most.
Okay. Oh, don't record that part. Oh, well. So I'm so excited that Professor Johnson is here with us today to introduce some of her latest work on thinking about the idea of the archive in relation to Black life. Her talk today is titled Death Acts, Hauntings, and Other Curious Adventures. Join me in welcoming Professor Johnson.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much. Marissa, Jeffrey, everyone who's here, who's going to join us, the five colleges, for having me here. I'm excited to share some of this work that I've been playing with, and really looking forward to this being a conversation. Of course, this is a work in progress, so I'm looking forward to your thoughts. And if there are things, just sort of bear with me. We'll move through this. We'll move through this together, juntos. All right. The title of this talk, as Marissa said, is Death Acts, Hauntings, and Other Curious Adventures. In 1773, Captain John Stedman sailed for Suriname with a pacification force organized by the Dutch. Their aim was to put down slave revolts that had been rocking the colony for the last year or so. Stedman arrived and he entered a plantation society where scene upon scene of curious adventures began to unfold. At one point, he happened upon 3 slaves being taken in chains to be killed. One was to be flogged below the gallows for an unclear or some unnamed reason. And so what I'll also do in this talk is not outline the quotes in different places, but if you want more on that, just stop me afterwards and I can tell you. One was to be flogged below the gallows for an unclear, or at least an unnamed reason. One was to be beheaded by axe for shooting a slave that had come to steal plantains on his owner's estate. Now, this is a thing he did at his mistress's order. She, to avoid being assessed a fine, if they'd been caught, she accused her own slave, who she'd ordered to do it, of theft, and she had him sacrificed. Now, the third was a slave named Neptune. Neptune was a free man of color, a carpenter, he was young and handsome. Neptune was accused of killing the overseer on an estate nearby. He'd stolen sheep to entertain a favorite young woman that he knew there, and the overseer grew jealous. The overseer wanted him hung, so in other words, he wanted him lynched, and Neptune shot him to prevent it. His punishment was to be broken on the rack with no mercy stroke. So the mercy stroke, after being broken on the rack, would have ended his torment, would have ended his life. This was denied him. The executioner, also a Black man, begins by chopping off his left hand, punishment presumably for the hand that stole the sheep and attempted to defend his own life by killing the overseer. And then he, the executioner, took up a heavy iron bar and with repeated heavy blows, broke the bones to shivers till the marrow, blood, and splinters flew about the field. The prisoner never uttered a groan nor a sigh. not at least while this was being done. The executioner then removed him from the rack, at which point Neptune writhed from the cross, the rack itself, fell on the grass, and damned them all as a set of barbarous rascals. He somehow removed his right hand from its bonds by the help of his teeth, Stedman describes, and then rested it on the timber and asked the bystanders for a pipe of tobacco, which was infamously answered by kicking and spitting on him, till Stedman, with some American seamen, thought proper to prevent it. Then he begged for his head to be cut off, to no avail. Left to die from the breaking, Stedman describes various things Neptune does as he succumbs to his wounds. He sings 2 or 3 songs. He asks a Jew for the money owed him. He notices a white soldier eating bread with no meat and remarks on how unusual that is. And when the soldier says he has no money for meat, Neptune says, "Then I will make you a present, sir. First pick my hand that was chopped off clean to the bones. Next begin to devour my body till you are glutted, when you will have both bread and meat as best consumes you, as best becomes you." Neptune doesn't die for 3 hours, according to Stedman, and he never stops talking. Mainstream coding of blackness, black studies, race theory, and black performance are in a moment of glorious excess and painful extravagance. Digital blackness explodes these 19th century codes of race and 18th century denominations of color. As users interrogate intersectionality, anti-blackness, and anti-violence on Tumblr, they also call out white supremacy via vines, snaps, and tweets, and sit in 140-character solidarity with anti-colonial and anti-violent movements from Gaza to Brazil. These posts are constructed and appear in a cyborg Creole, a kind of stank, funky digital vulgarity that employs hashtags, shorthands, and grammars to capture the flesh of a moment, a person, or a group. Digital media changes the ways users as readers and viewers digest information by breaking the linearity of interaction and introducing them to a multi-tiered landscape. In a digital media environment, you have lurkers, commenters, visitors, viewers, and users. These replace readers. New categories of identity activity are born and others end up falling away. So you've lost, in a lot of ways, a kind of single author who, in cahoots with maybe an editor or a publishing entity, guides a reader down distinct and clear paths in, say, a book. Presented instead with a series of choices, readers, viewers, users, lurkers, may now settle into a website or a project at any number of plot points. They may skim, they may indulge in media annotation, or they may leave the site entirely after a cursory glance at a subtitle. Viewed from a kind of digital utopian standpoint, this kind of range of choices, tools, and opportunities to engage, challenge, and create really appears democratizing. It appears to come without the old limits of difference and removed from history or context. This, of course, is not the case, and that standpoint has been critiqued and has been of some discussion in the field of digital humanities. So you have 2 here. One is the About for the Transformed DH Collective, an academic guerrilla movement that hopes to redefine digital humanities as a force for transformative justice. And then you have another that is perhaps less explicitly about social justice, but is about thinking critically about what we assume about something that seems as clear-cut as code. Suggesting that instead of saying code or coding is about finding a one correct command among many commands, among codecs, it is actually much more resonant with building, with creating, with thinking about how structures resonate with a discourse of encoded objects. And these are just 2. There are hosts of others critiquing, both individuals and collectives, critiquing critically engaging and challenging work in the DH, including Lisa Nakamura, Tara McPherson, Haystack, Post-Colonial Digital Humanities, Queeros, other folks. And so there are thankfully too many to name here. The conversation I want to have today is in coalition with these critiques. I want to posit digital blackness as a resource that suggests, among other things, that a discourse of encoded objects, to use Marino's phrasing, is a discussion that should be had in conversation with the commodification and racialization of New World subjects. So from my vantage as thinking about slavery, what do slave codes, the rise of Atlantic slaving, the moment of emancipation, slavery's afterlives, and black freedom struggles, or the struggles of subjects racialized as black to mark humanity and make legible and therefore challenge codes of anti-blackness inherent in the structure of the New World. These struggles often done in coalition with other racialized subjects, white and non-white. What do these have to offer as a way of thinking through the digital humanities' potential for social justice, accessibility, and inclusion? The digital, whether media, technology, or humanities, has already shown great power and potential for radicalizing individuals, for supporting organizing, and creating space for black survival. So how do we appreciate, use, and expand radical and resistive elements while resisting institutionalization, dehumanization, or further commodifying either the communities we consider ourselves accountable to or even ourselves? And what do slavery scholars have to offer to doing the same? So in a recent interview, Vincent Brown, who's a historian of Jamaica, Atlantic world, diaspora, and slavery, 18th century, noted that the archive of slavery is more than the record bequeathed to us by the past. It's also about design decisions that communicate our sense of history's possibilities. The description of Neptune's execution is from The Curious Adventures of John Stedman, which is published in London in 1806. The Curious Adventures is this tiny, almost pamphlet-sized publication. It is an abolitionist text. It's not the original narrative, which is more than one volume and is not an abolitionist text by any means. Stedman doesn't even claim to be that. Our purpose is stated in The Curious Adventures, and they say is merely to relate the severities which Stedman reports so the reader can celebrate that the British had just abolished the slave trade. So it's 1806, 1808 is when slave trading is supposed to be done. The British Navy is now patrolling the high seas and capturing the slave ships that are defying this order. Curious Adventures is, for all intents and purposes, 18th century media. It is also a ledger of torture. So what role do it and other items in slavery's archive play alongside the drive for data in death acts and social justice, in bringing practice together with discourse and theory, and embodying and actualizing a politics in which all Black lives matter and all Black people live forever? All right, so to think through this, I turn to the history of historians, slavery and data, how these have always been in conversation and been conversation for some time. So more than a kind of dialectic between history and memory, this push for thinking about data and the role that it should play in history of slavery actually has been key for some time. It's been key in the academy, it's been key among communities, and it's also been key among political institutions. For early Southern historians, one of the landmark names is U.B. Phillips. They drew on firsthand accounts of life in the South, focusing on the U.S. now, antebellum period, from the hands and minds of slave owners, which provided new data that could be used to interpret the making of the United States. Now, before that, the South didn't really have even a place in thinking about the history and the making of the United States. So Phillips turns to these accounts of slave owners to help make that happen. This is a very condensed historiography. Part of this collection included documents that were rife with registers of slaves, that were culled from plantation registers, and also slave ship manifests. This constructed an archive that rewrote the history of the United States to include the South, but let the period of bondage have this kind of rosy moonlight and magnolias glow, and that may be a phrase that people have heard before. By the 1960s and 1970s, a new group of historians based in the United States began to read such material very differently. Scholars like John Blassingame, Stanley Elkins, Eugene Genovese, Herbert Gutman, Kenneth Stamp, they revisited Southern texts to better understand the nature of Black life in the Americas, albeit themselves sort of emerged with somewhat different conclusions about things like slave personality, the role of African retentions, the role the slave owner played. Very, very different perspectives, but revisiting that data. Naturally, these histories and how they were written generated intense and very, very heated debates. In the 1970s, a subset of Clio-metricians, so Clio-metricians were a cohort of scholars who were interested in statistics and economic studies of history broadly, not just slavery. They grew especially interested in moving discussions of slavery beyond archival reproductions of diaries and travel narratives, slave owner testimonials, and into the realm of numerals and statistics. Their motivations centered around excising the tense emotional tenor of the topic by transforming discussions around slavery and Black life into something more clinical, right? So using something perceived then and now as objective and unbiased. Robert Fogel, who co-authored with Stanley Engerman, Time on the Cross, The Economics of Negro Slavery, which is what this table comes from. Fogel described that struggle with slavery as emerging from a desire to develop a precise, emotionally detached, ideologically neutral analysis. So they're very explicit about really wanting to push away from the emotions that are involved in the history. And Time on the Cross managed to, or attempted to quantify nearly all aspects of Southern slave society, including the everyday lived experience of Black life under bondage. What can data tell us about the everyday lives of slaves? Slave workloads, subsistence, plantation production, all of these came under scrutiny. And for Fogel and Engerman, the data was actually quite clear. Slaves' material lives were better on average than 20th century African American material lives. And slavery was an efficient, even modern, institution which did not degrade the American South. The problem was, at the time, that implying that Black life under slavery resembled anything close to subsistence or survival deeply offended historians steeped in the brutal realities of bondage, things like the separation of family, corporeal punishment, summary executions like the one I just described, rape and sexual violence. Scholars published expressive critiques, one of the more famous being Herbert Gutman, who wrote an entire book called Slavery in a Numbers Game, a critique of Time on the Cross, and noted, among other things, that first paragraph, that Time on the Cross follows the traditional model and is an erroneous model that has greatly limited understanding of enslaved Afro-Americans and their beliefs and behavior. The model mixes two processes together: how slaves learned and what slaves learned. In the search for truth at the intersection of history and memory, professional historians, policymakers, and political officials found it difficult still to unpack Black life beyond archetypes, icons, and caricatures, beyond tropes coded by law, beyond images circulated by media like Curious Adventures, and responded to the data based on history, context, positionality, and subjectivity, their own. Clio-metrics was and remains a buzzword, right? So it's analogous to ways that digital or big data sort of buzz individuals today. People are working in the field. Numbers and metrics were then and now enticing in their seeming neutrality. They failed, however, to escape an abolitionist-era conflation of slavery with death and disembodied kinship as a sum total of Black diasporic men, women, and children's lived experience. In Curious Adventures and texts like it, abolitionists' desire to and success at eliciting emotion from readers and viewers could not make manifest the weight of Black humanity. It did not result, for instance, the expression of execution, not result in equitable or equal treatment in post-emancipation era, and for many it was not meant to. The appeal to a hyper-emotional response by excessive reproduction of Black death and pain was meant to compensate for a dense archive of codes created over centuries and meant to numb subjects and citizens to Black torment. Time-traveling centuries later, Clio-metricians' desire to and failure to remove emotion from the discussion proved data alone also could not make manifest the weight of the accounting that needed to be underway and could not make it any easier or more explicit. So what you guys are listening to now is called Pauvre Piti. It's a track off Coin Coin Chapter 1, Jean de Couleur Libre by Martina Roberts. So who is Martina Roberts? I'll let it play a little bit in the background. Martina Roberts is a sound experimentalist, jazz saxophonist, composer, and improviser. Is born in Chicago, South Side. She's based in New York City right now. Coin Coin is her second project. It's named after a formerly enslaved woman of African descent named Marie-Thérèse Coin Coin Métayer, who was a progenitor of the Cane River Creoles in Natchitoches, Louisiana, which is about 4 hours north driving of New Orleans. If you ever come across or are familiar with the book Cane River by Lolita Tademi, this is that community, and she's also descended from them. Coin Coin was born in 1742, baptized Catholic, and enslaved to Louis Saint-Denis, the French founder-governor of Natchitoches. In 1767, after her owner's death, her ownership passed to his youngest daughter, who leased her to Claude Métayer. She bore Métayer several children, some of whom Métayer purchased and freed. And he eventually purchased and freed Coin Coin herself in 1778, so some 10 years later. As a free woman of color, Coin Coin took advantage of Spanish law to improve, which means you basically sort of add a home to a plot of land, maybe you plot crops, et cetera, et cetera. And doing that, she was able to eventually claim a plot of land so that by 1810, she had 7 living sons, and they, with their family, their own land, cattle, and about 58 slaves among them, actually were the only family in the area to own more slaves than, the only family in the area to own more slaves than them, were the white Métayer children. So they were the wealthiest family of color in the Natchitoches region. So Roberts, through family stories and history, learned she was descended from one of these children. She speaks in interviews about growing up, steeped in references to this longer lineage, including a grandfather who used to call her Coin Coin for fun. And the Coin Coin Project is described by her label, by Constellation Records, as a multi-chapter work that combines conceptual scoring, which is graphic notation, storytelling and historical narrative, performative theater, so costume, multimedia, and a deeply considered channeling of personal ancestry and a universal experience of Africans in the America. So this is an example here of one of the music sheets, composition sheets that she uses in graphic notation. So basically using something other than music notes in order to chart the songs. You can see years and dates, photos, et cetera. And so this is clearly resonant. Reviewers and critics who are looking at her work understand and capture this. And one reviewer described it as, in Coin Coin, Martina realized putting together fragments and snippets that wouldn't serve much purpose on their own could result in something new and meaningful. So since the first chapter was released in 2011, that's that first chapter you listened to, Roberts has used archival material, personal recollections, interviews with family members, digital and social media in a very dynamic fashion. She created a blog called In the Midst of Memory, using Blogger before it was owned by Google, with clips from the album, and eventually the album itself, Chapter 1, appeared there. It's the only album that sort of appeared carte blanche free. Information about Coin Coin, Jean de Couleur Libre. Jean de Couleur Libre is free people of color. Slavery, Louisiana, St. Louis, Chicago, all places that she charts her lineage through, all appeared on this site. So it became a kind of digital scrapbook. And other kinds of material appeared there. That blog no longer exists. Robertson used her Instagram account and Tumblr. She was at Steel Kilt Rose, which was meant to signify an Irish member of her family, another member of her lineage that she was charting. And she used her Instagram account and a Tumblr to document and share a cross-country journey around and throughout the United States, where she researched material for the next Coin Coin chapters. Mississippi Moonchild is Chapter 2, and River Runs Thee is Chapter 3. These accounts also no longer exist. A short film see if that works. Did not. Let's try it this way. That's okay because we got to look at some other stuff on here. A short film done in 2010 in Montreal accompanied the release of Chapter 2, which was Mississippi Moonchild. It's a grayscale audiovisual romp through sound, text, and spectral movements. Roberts, channeling Coin Coin, stands in an empty street in a white dress, saxophone in hand, playing at times a song we cannot hear over the screams of our archive. I have it muted right now, but it's available on YouTube. You're welcome to listen to it there. For chapter 3, River Runs Thee, Robert's own spoken word material draws on slave ship registers, like that of a Captain Sullivan, who she's really interested in. Captain Sullivan was a captain of one of the ships that was tracking down slavers that were still transporting slaves after the abolition of the slave trade. Roberts calls her technique panoramic sound quilting. This description, all the things that I just said, none of this actually really does her work justice, so you'll have to forgive me, you'll have to explore it. It's really fascinating work. When I first encountered it in 2011 as a historian of slavery, as a scholar, somebody who's really invested in digital media, I was writing as Kismet and I wrote this. The album, about Coin Coin, the album itself is an unsettling sound mixture that puts meat on the pain and confusion of slavery while still holding on to the creativity and the industry of Black women themselves, the stuff that helped them survive. It is music that is troubling and spirit-born all at the same time. So Pov Piti is the name of the track that I just played. It's also the name of a Creole folk song found along the Gulf Coast and the French overseas, both the Caribbean and also in the ocean. It means poor little in Creole, and it refers to a woman who has lost her lover. Sometimes this woman is named Lolotte, and sometimes her name is Mamzelle Zizi. Here is, let's pause you. Let's see if you're still playing. That went to, oh, hello. To give you a sense of sort of Pov Piti, the original.
Pov Piti, Mamzelle Zizi, Pov Piti, Mamzelle Zizi, li gagna bo 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 bo, dans ce petit chat. Pov Piti, Mamzelle Zizi, li gagna bo 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 bo, li gagna une maladie, dans ce petit charali. Kala le poté madras, le poté jipon garni. Kala le poté le soie, le poté belle. Pauvre petit Mamzelle Zizi, li gagna une maladie, li gagna bo 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 bo, dans ce petit chat.
So that's a little bit more upbeat, definitely still a lament, still slow and meant to evoke, you know, poor lady, poor baby. It's also the song and the theme. Mamzelle Zizi especially have also inspired sort of more upbeat versions. And this is actually from, by an artist of 19th century musician from Réunion. And you'll hear the difference, you should hear the difference immediately. That's a more upbeat French well, not Atlantic, but French world, overseas department version. And then one that is certainly a more modern, very, very New Orleans version is by a well-known New Orleans artist, Dr. John. So again, all of these draw on the same story, same Mamzelle, same pauvre petit. What we listened to from Matana was not a Creole lament necessarily, or was it? Certainly was not a dance tune. Matana begins her version or naming of pauvre petit, the poor little girl with guttural cries. These eventually resolve into what you heard, a jazz saxophone, over which Roberts begins to channel her ancestress, Coin Coin, as a young girl. This is where I probably got too quiet for you to hear. But as Coin Coin, Matana reflects on the death of her mother from yellow fever, on being a slave, nigra, and therefore a tool of the earth. These are phrases that are used in sort of that haunting voiceover, the channeling. On memory, I was only 16, there will never be any pictures of me. All of this in what might be a reference to her becoming an orphan at 16 when her parents die of yellow fever, or her impending pregnancy at 17, or her future, in Coin Coin's future, sexual assaults, capitulation, and or partnership, whichever side of the coin you're viewing it, with Claude Metoyer. This is her last owner in Natchitoches. So in some ways, it may be also worth comparing her sound in pauvre petit I'm going to hope that an ad does not pop up. To the sound of Abby Lincoln's evocation of prayer, protest, and peace in Triptych. Prayer, protest, and peace. It's having a bit of difficulty playing. If I can play it in the question and answer, I definitely will. You can hear some of the same sound, right? The sound of pain, the sound of protest, the sound of what a kind of black struggle might sound like, might look like. What is that imagining? And this is one of the things that I think can be interesting if we're thinking about hauntings and crossings, about the sound of, the emotion, the feeling of slavery, and the way that, for example, that dominates Matana's project. So at one point in the interview, she talks about sort of her relationship to Coin Coin. I have a really big interest in the spirit world, talks a little bit about that. And one of the things she says is that she stopped trying to contact people on the other side. She stopped doing it as a teenager because she heard it can induce states of psychosis if you don't have a proper guide. So I left that behind, and I realized that music is my medium, my guide. So I turned to Pov Piti, Matana Roberts, and Coin Coin in the context of us talking about digital humanities and data, because I think they pose interesting questions for how we think about what can and cannot be done in slavery's archive and with historical narratives of bondage, particularly around questions of intimacy, sex, violence, and desire. It also asks us to think about how to use the ephemerality of digital and social media, the appearance and disappearance of blogs, of Tumblrs, of, in this instance, Twitter, for her, Instagram, in the service of a history and memory that does not reproduce humans as solely nodes of data. And I wanted to use these questions of hauntings and crossings as guideposts in a conversation about crossing digital humanities with the archive of slavery as an act that inevitably was going to generate histories of intimate violence, of torment, but also of resistance. So from a Black Code Studies framing, Matana Roberts, Pov Piti, the entire Coin Coin project, all of this is maroon code. It gets away from the text, from the archive. It transforms. It uses the digital tools available, our relationship to sound, subjects, and subjectivity, living and the dead. All of these things are reshaped in relationship to the way that she is using the project. At points over and over, Coin Coin and the project itself disappear from sight. They reappear on sites in whispers and fantasies. I can find, for instance, images Roberts used to post on Instagram that were archived by different jazz websites. And the whisper of that is actually as tormenting as the images themselves. What she forces us to think about, and to think, asks me to think through two things I've been struggling with in my own work and in this relationship between data and slavery, which are how to be, for instance, a radical politics of citation. What do we create that is actually a radical politics of citation? And what does it mean to do a hypertextual history of people who did not leave written texts? Is this a place where the archive and the code can intersect? There is as much to know and not know as there is to sort of dismantle our knowing of in entering the lists. One of the things that Catherine McKittrick has done and described doing in her kind of experience of encountering these diasporic horrors in the archive, and culling what we can know from a list of names and what lies in these margins between the list of names and the edge of the paper, between the sign and the list itself. So McKittrick does a kind of critical read of walking through the reference section of the library. She deliberately reorders the list. She fragments encyclopedic texts. She mystifies bibliographic classification to reveal the power underlying how we consume, produce, and organize knowledge. Coin Coin is not Matana Roberts' biography, right? So this is not a history of Black women in the slave trade or of sex and slavery in the Atlantic world. But she does something of the same, led by kinship, her own relationship to the history, led by feeling, emotion, and sense. She unveils, dismantles, and even dissembles. And so I wonder if doing truly embodied and data-rich histories of slavery requires similarly remixing conceptual, discursive, and archival geographies, and doing so with deliberate, pained intimacy, and likely with some kind of violence. All right, so if we are to marry code to blackness in the making of a new world, it is impossible to leave this discussion without at least visiting the slave ship. It is in the slave ship where this push to rationalize meets the push to register, to document, to excise emotion as a necessary arm of the data collection project, which in a lot of ways is also a slaving project. You can use this quote to think through this from Simone Brown. The violent regulation of blackness as spectacle and as disciplinary combined in the racializing surveillance of the slave system. African women are actually a break, I'm going to suggest, and I'm going to try and lay that out a little bit before we close, are a break in this registration process. Quantitatively, they're at the margins of the trading company and would-be plantation owners' ledgers. They still remain really central in the everyday to slave owners' fantasies, to their anxieties, to the performance of power and mastery. So let me try and flesh that out. La Traversée, there is a slave ship. It leaves Senegal on October 29, 1727, and the death toll begins immediately. Dysentery, scurvy, sailor dies of fever. At least 2 slaves die mort subite, which is just sudden death. On January 2nd, 1728, while anchored at Quai Saint-Louis in Saint-Domingue, so Saint-Domingue is what becomes Haiti, the pilot wrote that the captain put 61 sick neg pièces d'Inde, pieces of the Indies, ashore. Pieces, bits, portions, shards of the Indies. These are what these slaves are. A passenger picked up at Senegal dies of fever somewhere around here. A cross marks that margin between the scrawl and the edge of the ledger where slaves who had been baptized before death on shore by their owners, if they were owned at the comptoirs, where these slaves have expired, or they've died. Nothing marks the margin for unbaptized slaves. 9 of the slaves who died were nursing babies. So this is sort of a thinking through of the slave ship register and voyage of Le Duc de Noir. You can find this voyage in the slave trade database, also in things like the Atlas of the Transatlantic Slave Trade, Elsis and Richardson. And if you have questions about that, I can give a kind of short, truncated history of how that came about, the database itself. Le Duc, I'm going to say that for short, loaded slaves at Saint Louis and Gorée in Senegal through most of the summer, and by January in 1728, it arrived at Saint-Domingue. It had one of the highest mortality rates of the 23 ships that traveled the Atlantic from Africa to Louisiana. La traversée is the crossing. The final total tallied 47 men, 14 women, 8 boys, 5 girls, and 9 suckling infants, so children who were still nursing, children and infants who were still nursing. Scurvy had decimated the ship, but decisions made by the captains and agents of the company at Saint-Domingue, where it first stopped, actually exacerbated the problem. So although Le Duc arrived at New Orleans in the dead of winter, at Saint-Domingue, neither the company, the ship captain, nor any of the agents had thought to give the slaves warm clothing. The slaves, of course, are on this ship naked throughout the journey. En route from Saint-Domingue to New Orleans, 25 more slaves actually died of hypothermia and other related illnesses. So Le Duc recorded his gender data solely in those who passed away. That's how we know there's 14 women and 5 girls. Otherwise, we would have no idea. They're not marked that way. They're marked in a lot of ways as pieces of the Indies. So we can turn to and try to flesh out what that is. We can turn to a favorite in thinking about travel narratives in the archive of slavery, Jean-Baptiste Labat. So Labat, between the 1690s and the 1720s, he does a lot of traveling around the French Caribbean. He's in Martinique and Guadeloupe, St. Kitts, other places. And by 1728, he's back in France, and he's also writing a travel narrative about life in West Africa. In it, he describes what a piece of the Indies is. I'm just going to say it in English to spare you any kind of butchering of French accent that I have. Slaves were counted as a full piece of the Indies if they fit particular variables, if they were younger than 30, if they were older than 10, if they had all of their fingers, legs, toes, eyes, ears, and teeth, if they weren't hunchbacked or lame or otherwise seemed to have a disability, blind, sick, other kinds of things. If the flaws were too much, the director of the company, this is all happening in West Africa, the director of the company could reject the sale, could reject that slave as a viable currency, as a viable piece of the Indies, thing to exchange. But more often than not, and considering how hungry slave traders were for slaves, slaves would need to be really debilitated in order to not end up loaded on ships. So what agents would try to do is to just combine. They would use equivalents. So 2 children or 2.5 children might equal a grown man. 3 children for 1 or 3 for 2, depending on the mood of the agents of the company. Infants, suckling infants, never counted. They don't count as a full anything. They're not old enough to even labor. And women were also not a full piece of the Indies. Their price was determined using these same equivalents. So a small woman and 2 children might equal a full piece of the Indies, might equal a grown man. So Labat, as some of you may know, and if you don't, it's interesting, has been described by historians as a notorious slave trading, swashbuckling pirate priest of the Dominican order who was also a prolific and plagiarizing writer of travel accounts. He was terrible. He's a terrible person. He was a travel writer of Africa who never left the ship. He stole from governors who were writing about their experiences there. He stole from the archive of letters. He remixed the account to suit his own interests. He had narrative flair. He was a scoundrel. This doesn't mean, however, that his work did not comprise, as other scholars have noted, a reasonable image of 18th century French knowledge about Africa, and because of that, larger European knowledge about Africa in the 18th century. So, to put it like this, Labat's books were bestsellers in their time, and as media helped create and solidify a base knowledge about Africans that as texts became gospel and ended up being integrated in what becomes the first encyclopedia of the West. It becomes encyclopedic, regardless of whether he actually hit the coast. It becomes an archive and it becomes a database before the French slave trade had even really kicked off running. In it, you can see a push to rationalize. You also see this kind of push to rationalize across other kinds of texts. In 1719, for instance, as another kind of final example, the Company of the Indies in France begins to send its first slave ships across the Atlantic to Louisiana. And it wants to be really, really clear about how to maximize the most profit that it can. So they lay out detailed instructions. Avoid prolonging the voyage. Avoid exposing slaves or crew to disease. Don't stop in Africa or the America after leaving your ports. You might lose slaves, you might get caught in revolts. The agents may try and trade better slaves for weaker slaves. All kinds of things could happen. Take good care of the health of your blacks. Prevent the black women from being debauched by the black men and the crew. Clean and scrape the slave quarters every day to avoid rot. Avoid purchasing slaves over 30, younger than 8, that piece of the Indies margin of currency. And avoid pirates, which is always good advice. Spillers. So there are two examples. So Horton Spillers has described the Middle Passage itself as a dehumanizing, ungendering, and defacing project of African persons. And in the French slave trade to Louisiana, you see the life cycle of this kind of project as imagined by the agents of the Company of the Indies, as financed by investors, ship owners, and slave owners, or would-be slave owners who were eager to acquire this free labor, as enforced with brutal force by captains, sailors, soldiers, guards. All of this unfolds across letters between governors and the trading company on both sides of the Atlantic and in the slave ship registers themselves. This is how data is made. This is the data we then have. So to conclude, to bring these into some kind of engagement and relationship, in bringing digital blackness into conversation with digital humanities, in particular these histories of slavery, slavery's archives, slavery's subjects, I'm actually asking us to explore some of the characteristics of slaving most salient to thinking through what a world of slaves would sound, look, and feel like. What is our responsibility for charting and unveiling these subterranean routes, both vertically through the slave ship's archive from the bottom of the ocean, but also horizontally, right? So across lines in a ledger that get us to these answers. For me, it is especially legible in also asking what would have been most salient to female slaves, how they were transformed from women and girls in their home communities, albeit at times themselves women laborers or enslaved or pawned between households, how they were transformed into currency, and not even full currency, not full pieces of the Indies, and commodities, these tallies of death and registers, sometimes marked or unmarked by baptism, pregnancy, or cause of death. Because they did not fit and were made to fit, they are a kind of problematic remainder and needed to be created, and this is a kind of spiller phrase also, for the system to function properly, but they also operate in a way that the system, that illuminates the ways the system actually dysfunctions properly. So to try that again, the terror of the female slaves' experience, but also their resistance to bondage actually reveals itself in the same slips and cracks of the data, as in, and gives light to resistance at all kinds of levels. So if Laclave dismantled gender, did resistance to it likewise sort of lay through its own contestation the foundation for new kinds of kinships, novel reformulations of the domestic, these new polymorphous gender reimaginings as well. And what are the ways that thinking through data and digital humanities can also capture that and bring that into all conversation to each other so we get that kind of sound that we hear in POV-PT evocative in the database as well. Thank you.
So we'll open it up for questions now. I feel like you can moderate yourself, but we do have a microphone. It doesn't amplify, but it's excellent because we enjoy making sort of recordings for other audiences, so the microphone helps with that.
Okay.
Sure. I think you brought up an article written by an economist, Engerman, Felgerman, something like that.
Yes.
And I didn't get, maybe I missed it. What's your stance on economic papers on this issue?
No, I didn't quite say it. I think there's some really interesting ways that, let's see if I can pull up that slide. So I think one of the things that I didn't say it because I'm sort of trying to work through it a little bit. I think that data is actually really, really important. You know, I think having, for instance, you know, now this information about the slave ship is actually really, really crucial to understanding how the voyages across the Atlantic, what ports are important, who comes across and when. How can we understand the ways that, what kind of connections can we then make between Africans, in my case, Africans who are coming from a place like Senegal and ending up in New Orleans. I do wonder about the ways that seeing data as a kind of end run around dealing with either the emotive aspects of slavery and bondage and the relationship that communities themselves have to it, or to try to avoid the kind of like implications of a history of slavery, you know, implications that people evoke now in things like police violence, implications that people evoke in questions about reparations. There are ways that pulling into the data serves some people's interests to kind of not deal with any of that. And I think that economic history can sometimes, how can economic history then merge the humanities piece with, you know, its drive for data as well. And I think it's what digital humanities is supposed to do. It's supposed to bring data, digital, these technological aspects into conversations with how people live on an everyday basis and what's important to them. That makes sense. Does that answer you? Yeah. But there's a tension. Say like?
Right, yeah. The conclusion of that paper, I think I read that paper,
Yeah.
that slavery was efficient. That's a scary outcome.
It's a terrifying outcome. And at the time, and it's interesting, like Fogel and Zimmerman felt, they've written about feeling sort of scorned by doing that study and that project at a time when African Americans in the 60s, 70s are actually struggling for services, for resources from local, state, federal governments, right? So they're saying, look, things are worse than in slavery. So they're seeing this as, look, you can use this as evidence, you know, but it also sort of diminishes actually what bondage was and ends up not serving that same policy purposes. And Moynihan did the same thing. Moynihan was trying to say, no, look how terrible it is for impoverished Black communities. Look, they have female-headed households. What are we going to do about that? Well, let's think about the implications of saying that as a negative thing, but also let's think about the kind of connections you're trying to make and the service that people put slavery and its history and its archive to is sometimes removed from not the reality, but like the real violence that is done, you know? And it's not to say the violence should also be overemphasized, but like how do we bring these things into better conversation with each other and be accountable, if that makes sense. So, yeah. Yes.
Caught a little bit, on the quotation from Matana Roberts that you showed us and read us, where on the one hand, she wants to say, okay, I used to try to make contact with the spirit world, but I don't do that anymore because I didn't have a medium or a proper guide.
Right.
But music is that
Yes.
for me. And so I was just wondering if you could say a little bit, or think through that tension between, on the one hand, that's not what I'm doing, and on the other hand, implicitly through the music, that is. You know what I mean?
Yeah, she is really fascinating to me. And I think there's nothing in her music that to me suggests that she is not contacting the other side, or trying to, or making an attempt to. The short video, Mississippi Moonchild, is all of 10 minutes, but it's basically either a haunting or trying to be a haunting, her trying to be a ghost, or an actual sort of spectral rendering. And I'm not sure, you know, I wonder if it's the kind of thing where music can be sort of, for her as an artist, like that be her security blanket in order to enter into that history. One of the things that's interesting, I'm gonna do an end run around your question. So one of the things that's interesting about Pof Biti, the track that you guys heard, is that that's her screaming. And it's actually her screaming within 6 months, her mother had died. And so she talks about her mother having just passed, not wanting to have to do this particular track, not wanting to have to bring out that pain, but feeling like there was no way to get into the story she wanted to tell in POV-PT without doing it herself. That she literally says, something was calling me to do this. And so there's all these ways that, there's kind of multiple channelings that are going on that she uses, and I think that she is using music and this project in particular to work through. And it's supposed to be a 12-volume set. So it's not ending anytime soon. So it'll be interesting to see what other kind of things that she ends up, what other kind of hauntings and crossings she ends up working her way into. But yeah. Thanks for that.
Thank you so much for that talk. Thanks. I have a question about, I'm just hoping you could say more about the sort of affective dimensions that you were talking about in relation to data. And I was thinking about the juxtaposition between feeling and data from the that article.
Yeah.
And I'm just curious about what you see as the political possibilities or the radical possibilities of new media in relation to potentially to feeling and affect.
Yeah. So one of the things that this is a really good question. I think it's an important one, not just for right now, but one of the first times I sort of talked about the ways that slavery and medieval humanities work is I was also working through clips in social media, images and circulation of things from Ferguson and Black Lives Matter, et cetera, which are meant to be emotive or meant to evoke a particular feeling and mobilize feeling in the work of social justice, right? So I think there are ways that feeling, affect, the actualization of emotion can be put to a particular kind of work. I also think there's really interesting ways that, that for example, like in Curious Adventures, that also was feeling being put to work, meant to overcome a particular rendering of Black people as being able to take any kind of torment, but also meant to force an audience to feel something, to make a move, to do something, but it does it at the expense of a spectacle of Black violence and death. And I think there's something there at the time that was edgy, uncomfortable, problematic in the gray area of usefulness, useful to Black humanity. At the time, and I think there's something to that now, the way that images of Black death also gets regurgitated, gets appear in social and digital media, are circulated. So I'm not sure that I think it's a thing that ends up getting worked out as much in practice and constant coalition and conversation. I don't know if there's a necessarily clear answer. And I think that that's sort of that tension, right? So like how to avoid resting on sort of rules and guidelines and data and institutionalizing policies over thinking about what are the kind of changing nature of humanity. Like how do you deal with and grapple with the need to, for instance, the need for this, sorry, not that, well that too, but the need for this at a particular moment versus the circulation of death throes, Sandra Bland, Natasha McKenna, Eric Garner, more recent ones, like over and over and over. So at what point does the line get too far? It's tough, and what it is what the problem is that it's bumping up a continued struggle for outlining what is humanity, right? At what point is the line of pain and grief too much, and at what point does it sort of mark out something that is inhuman, that now we can have sympathy for because we are human and we should have sympathy, versus understanding that there's a real injustice and a violence that's happening. And I'm not sure there's clear guidelines there. I do know that data, those who are dealing in data and numbers and metrics have to think about it if they're going to do data, period, but if they're going to do anything related across Blackness and the digital, they're going to have to think about it, because there's no way there's no way to avoid it. On either side, either over-emotionalizing or trying to take all emotion away, neither of them actually capture anybody's humanity, and neither of them are an accounting of what has happened and what needs to be done in the future. So the answer is fuzzy, but the answer gets worked out in practice. I hope, I think. So. Yes.
So I had a
Thanks for
question
asking you guys
about like, what would you say, I guess, along those lines, like when it comes to creating and re-archiving slavery and those histories that were not archived at the time and were often left out, and you have to kind of fill in the blanks yourself now, centuries removed from it.
Yeah. Well, you know, I said I was just going to ask you guys questions. I actually would almost turn that back around, because one of the things that Matana Roberts is trying to do is sort of fill in those gaps. One of the lines in Coin Coin, both in Pov Piti but throughout that album, is that there are no pictures of me. There are no pictures of me. So how does she then sort of connect with the history and a genealogy of which there's presumably no evidence? I'm curious, like, is what she does convincing? Is what she does it capture the ancestry, the ancestress that she is trying to evoke? Or is it too much? Or is it too little?
I think it's hard because then we kind of get back to what you were saying about Labat, who like did not ever step foot in Africa, anywhere in Africa, but like was able to sell these stories based off of previous knowledge of what people, and French people in particular, knew about Africa and other people who had actually been. And I feel like sometimes we get into that kind of like mode of thinking as well, is like I'll play off what people already assume about slavery. Right. So it is effective because we associate these like laments and these like these sort of sounds with slavery when we think about it, just based off of like media we have now with like 12 Years a Slave, other films like that, other archives of what we imagine slavery to have been, but we don't have necessarily, not that I know of, any archive from actual slavery times that like would give us something to compare to. Right.
At least as far as sound, we don't really, as far as I know, we do not have the sound archive, and that's just the technology that was created. But what I also hear you saying is that we all have an archive ourselves of slavery, that a resource, right, an effective or sonic resource that, for better or for worse, we tap into when something like Pov Piti comes on. You know, so there's something interesting there. Is there something useful, or is it a hindrance? You know, is it a block? I don't know. Yeah.
Well,
I
don't have to take over the fact that I'm holding the mic. Legitimately raise their hand.
So I was just going to thank you so much for your talk. I don't think this is working because.
So it doesn't
okay.
actually.
Thank you. Okay, I'll continue. So we don't have a sound. This is true, and I was interested when you were speaking earlier about that slippage between Neptune and the conversation that he's having for hours apparently before he dies, and then and then Lose Your Mother, you know, having this slave figure who doesn't say anything. There's no speech, and then you have, you know, Matana Roberts trying to reproduce that sound, and I'm looking at that thinking about slave spirituals and how that is the sound, like that is the repetition of that, whatever that looks like for that location, and because there are so many of those songs, and because they're all so different, you know, I think that there's something there that constitutes the sonic. But also when you show the cover image of I actually got stuck because I thought, well, photography is not invented until 1839. Who is on this cover? Because it most certainly is not, as you said.
Yeah, it's not.
It is not this ancestor. So then who is this person coming out of the archive as well, and then, you know, occupying that space so that you can negotiate, so that she can negotiate both sight and sound at the same time. it's enough. Like, it's enough for you to, to be able to build an alternative archive out of, So yeah, thank you for that.
Oh, thank you. I just find this fascinating, so I'll just put that up.
While I'm walking it over to Sarah, just to add to the thoughts, one thing that occurs to me is that I think that all of this is usefully pointing also to like the power and limits of metaphor and simulation, and the ways that when we're talking about like the idea of data, it's so easy, as you've pointed out and as we've seen, to slip in and out of, even when we're thinking about building an archive, building a better one, and what constitutes as better. Is it something that's more objective by the power of data? But even like the data tables that you presented are still a mediation and still a simulation of sorts. They're a kind of representation. And I think it's really interesting the way it's like, well, obviously, yes, what Matana Roberts is doing is metaphor. Metaphor gets us a really long way until we run up against something.
Right.
So anyway,
right. I mean, just to respond real quick. I think we have time. Yeah. That's extremely interesting, and it makes me think of both the slave ship database itself and how it gets created and the contestation over that, but also there was a conference at Michigan State 2013 in November that was around databases and how do you build databases around slaves. And so you have people from all around the world who are bringing in their databases. And what you found immediately is exactly that even Matana's sort of metaphoric experience and engagement and conversation, right, with ghosts and hauntings, it seems legible to us, but we add metaphors to how we understand and categorize slaves, the crossing, the passage, all the time, and have done it since we've looked at these documents. The naming of the different spaces along the coast has changed and changes depending on what country you're actually looking at the archive in. And so when these databases came together at this conference, one of the first problems that came up was an ancient problem of what do we do with African ethnicities that all have different names, African of color and race, that also all has different designations depending on what empire slaves were operating in, and depending on what colonies became nations, and et cetera, et cetera. And all of those sort of operate on the same thing, like what assumptions do people, the database creators, apply to the variables at any particular time, So there's nothing, there's not nothing, but I think that the extent to which humans are sort of imposing and engaging with code and data and variables and data basing is actually much more and can be seen in moments like this when we're dealing with digital blackness. So, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I was basically gonna say something about those same ideas. I think metaphor and invention and imagination are not outside of what archives are for. I'm an archivist, and when we're working with people who are working in the archives, particularly when you're talking about people who are trying to do research on stories that don't themselves appear in the archive, but appear sort of in between the stories in the archive, and I think data can be especially fruitful for that because it's not trying to construct its own narrative as a matter of course. So when you're reading histories, they're constructing a narrative for you. Mm-hmm. When you're reading data, there are lots of holes in between these numbers. Yeah. And it's something, especially I think working with students, we're always trying to get them to think about, is that their own imaginations about what they're reading is not outside of the story. And it's one of the things I love about Matana Roberts' work is she's totally taking archives as a diving off point and not just asking what is the experience and what's my experience and what's the ancestors' experience, but she's actually reconstructing a kind of abstract history, right? And the imagination or the metaphor is central to that. It's not besides the point. Yeah. So it's sort of it's not exactly a question, but I'd love to just hear you talk about this space of imagination that's created and like somewhere between the data-based histories and the abstractions of Matana's art making, right? There's that.
Right. Thank you for that. Also, thank you for knowing Matana, because I've been obsessed with her for for years. 4
or 5 years ago.
Oh gosh. It's amazing. I think imagination is crucial, and it's a thing that I'm starting to return to working through more rigorously. I'm reading Lamanda Stallings' book, Functhoerotic, in which I'm just in the first few pages, but imagination is really central. And it's central as a way to to tie pieces in the archive together, pieces of history together, but it's also central as a resistance strategy, you know, so not just a labor that fills in the gaps, but a labor that corrects injustices and violences and heals, right? And so it's something that I'm still sort of working through and thinking about, but I think it has to play a really important role. And I think it also plays, as I think we're sort of all saying, or we're saying, people feel just free to disagree. I think it already plays a role. It already plays a role in how we are thinking about what to call what in databases and in naming data. It already played a role at the time in how things like Curious Adventures are created, in how slave owners are imagining pieces of the Indies as currency, and arbitrarily, you know, they're imagining what a woman, an African woman, what her labor will be across the Atlantic in order to bring currency together. So there's already imagination happening. So on the one hand, it's recognizing the ways that things aren't necessarily arbitrary, and imagination isn't, you know, imagination is always at work, right? But it's also about, you know, how is that then, you know, can that be mobilized as a resource, you know, to think about resistances that happen, correctives and things like that. So I think it's really, really crucial. It's something I'm excited to be kind of coming back to in this particular work. But certainly if that's part of the humanities part of the digital, and it has to be part of the conversation. So, yeah.
Probably stop there.
Oh.